everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Pain, Heart, and Home Healing After Loss. I actually have a repeat guest here with me today. It's trauma-informed certified coach Mike-Ayala White. Mike, thanks for coming back on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm ready to have a good conversation.
Yes, me too. So Mike posted this quote on Instagram a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, oh, I love this. And I've never really heard it. I've seen and heard lots of quotes about grief, and I've never heard it put quite like the quote that he had put. And I was like, I want to explore it more. So I immediately messaged him and I was like, hey, I love that. Like, I would love to discuss that concept with you more. And so we set up a time to chat, and then I was like, well, we might as well not waste good conversation, with some good info. So let's turn it into an episode. And he was like, let's do it. So here we are. We're unpacking this super awesome quote for the first time together. But before I even say what the quote is, I just want to give you an opportunity to tell everyone like where you heard it and like the context around it. I believe you said you were at some conference. Like, what was it? What were you talking about? Like, what was the context around it?
Yeah, first so much. Thanks so much for having me back on. I really appreciate it, and what you do in the reality of talking about grief and pain and loss and trauma and how to keep going. Like, it's such an important field that here in America and in the West that we don't talk about enough, and we try to avoid, and we have a whole culture that will give us anything we want to avoid that pain. So thanks for being a voice for that. It wasn't even a conference. Like, it's so hard to describe. Like, it was just an event. It was called We Go on Tour, and it was a night about grief, and it was a mixture of a concert, a comedy show, videos, discussion, panels, all in one night, and it was all surrounding grief. And it was one of the most unique things I've ever been involved in by far. And I loved it. And there was really four guys that helped to lead it that had all experienced different forms of severe grief in their own life. And so this wasn't just textbook for them. They've had to walk this stuff out. And so that's where I heard the quote from one of the guys. Shout out to John O. And I'll try to give their Instagram links and the social media links after for the episode, but he's the one who said that quote, and he had lost his brother unexpectedly 10 years ago, and he talked about that particular quote, and I just remember hearing it, and it punched me right in the gut, where I was like, okay, so what do I do with that now that I've heard it, and what do I do in how I view life and how I view grief? So, incredible event. They've been touring all over the U.S. I saw them in Nashville, and that was supposed to be the final date, but it must have gone pretty well because they've added like a European tour, which is pretty cool to see as well.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. I honestly, as much as involved as I am in the space, I've never heard of any events quite like that. And so that's definitely piques my interest. Okay, so so the quote is, grief is not a journey to be traveled. Grief is a language to become fluent in. And so let's just, start to unpack it. So I know you've had some time to like think through it and maybe process it, and same, like I've been thinking about it, and as I was preparing for today, the concept has developed a little bit, but what was your like initial take on it? Like, that grief is less of a journey to be on and more of a language to speak. What were your like initial thoughts that came to your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my initial thoughts were like, okay, so how I viewed grief as a journey, or like people have talked about like different concepts of like the grief river, like you're flowing in the grief river and you just have to let it do what it does. And there's truth to that and health to that. But this was different. There was a form of intimacy here that I had not heard before, where if you know anything about languages, what language can do is, depending on how the language is set up, it can actually inform the way that you view time. And here in the West, we view time very linearly, point A to point B. But over in the East, it's very circular. It's very different. there's not an ending point like we understand it here. And so when I think about grief as a language and becoming intimate with that and becoming familiar and chewing on that and learning it in that way, it takes that linear process of grief, which, by the way, the original study, I can't remember her name, the doctor who performed the original study on the different stages of grief, anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, things like that. The original study was actually performed on people with terminal illnesses. And the reason why that's important is because it was walking with them on how they were processing the fact that their life was probably going to end. What it wasn't used for was for the rest of us that were still going to be here after they were gone. And so it's fascinating because it's like we take that study for people that have lost people and we're like, use this. But when you look at the original context, that's not even who it's for. It's for the people who are processing that they were going to pass away. It was never intended, at least the way that I've seen it and heard it, for the rest of us that are still going to be here going, well, how do I process what just happened? And so when I started to combine those two things, what it did for me was it took the lid off the timeline of grief. And the way that he explained it was fascinating, which was how he could grieve the same thing in different ways in different seasons. And it really gave a compassion and a kindness to, I should be over this, whatever that actually means. You know, like it's years later and people are still grieving the same thing in a different way. And there's almost this like guilt of like, I should be over this. This shouldn't be affecting me this way. And we get a bad case of the shoulds, which is also shame. And now all of a sudden we're actually not able to be present because we're so worried about the fact that we haven't gone through the stages of grief. And as I wrestled this out, it really started to inform my own life, where I started to look at examples of loss and go, you know, unintentionally, I have grieved some of these in different seasons in different ways. And I didn't even necessarily know that I was doing it. But those points were some of the healthiest points for me, was when I was able to go, it's been, gosh, double-digit years since I've lost my grandfather. Just, he got old and he passed away. One of the most important figures in my own life. And there are still times now, even recently, within the past couple of weeks, where like it's come back up. And it's like, shouldn't I be over this? And it's like, no. Like, I'm not the same person since he's been gone. C.S. Lewis talks about this as well, where when he lost, I think it was Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien, they were in the same book club. He talked about how there was a part of him that would never come out again because Tolkien was gone. And it's such a fascinating concept to go, like, when we are centered in who we've been made to be, there are parts of us that when we lose people, those parts may never come out again. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. It means that we're learning the language of grief and we are forever changed. So those were some first initial thoughts that hit me within the first 3 or 4 days, where I was like, man, I'm in this. Like, this is really messing with me in a really good way.
Yeah. That's so interesting. You just said so many things that I'm like, whoa, especially that debunking of the 5 stages of grief, because I think anybody who has been on, who deals with grief, I guess, or is learning to speak that language or on the journey, however you want to call it, or however you view it, would look at those stages and go, I certainly didn't experience these stages in order, and I've experienced this stage multiple times, and I come back to this stage several times. And it's, so I love that analogy of the circle. You know, you talked about, you know, in the East, how they view time more circularly. And that's an incredible analogy, because that is so normal with grief. You feel things in a circular motion. It's not like, okay, we've met this milestone and now we're never coming back to it, so I'm never going to feel the way that I have felt in this moment ever again. That is so untrue. And I really love that, because, like I said, it debunks those stages. And I think it takes that pressure and that burden off of grievers who feel like, shouldn't I be past this? Shouldn't I be further along? Shouldn't I be done feeling these feelings? Shouldn't it be easy to see babies now for me, or to see pregnancy tests and, or, you know, pregnancy announcements, and shouldn't this, shouldn't that, shouldn't that? And it's like, wait a minute. From my personal experience, one day I'm here, and the next I'm here, and the next I'm here, and the myth is that linear journey, because when you reach that point again, you're like, wait a minute. It puts this guilt and, like you said, that shame on you to feel like I shouldn't be feeling this anymore. And I really love that, and I hope there's people listening right now that can feel that that burden or that guilt or that shame just lifting off of them as we're talking about this, because when you walk a straight line, of course you're going to, if you feel these feelings over and over again, or you hit these milestones, or you feel like you keep coming back to these times in your grief, it's easy to feel shameful or to feel like you're doing it wrong. So I hope this is alleviating some of that burden. And it's funny that you're saying these things, because this is so not the take that I originally had when I heard this. And so it's interesting to me to see two totally different sides of the coin. And so my initial thoughts, and where my brain went immediately, and we can come back and unpack whatever we want, but where my brain went was, I heard this in almost in like a literal sense. And so, because when I'm speaking to someone, anyone, about my loss, I can usually tell right away if they have also experienced some sort of profound loss, or are familiar with grief in some way. And sometimes that's in what they say and like the literal words that come out of their mouth, but sometimes that's in the silence or the nonverbal communication that they present when I'm talking to them. And so to me, that metaphor, that grief is more of a language, honestly, it resonated with me so much, and probably why I was like, oh, I love that, because I have literally experienced, and I'm sure you have, and I'm sure everybody who's listening has, those literal experiences when you're communicating with someone, when you're speaking to someone about grief. And so for me, it kind of took on this like literal form. Because I think there is some level of communication between two people who know what grief is and have experienced a loss.
Yeah.
I think there is like a literal language that two people can speak.
Yes, I would totally agree. And it's funny you say that, because I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with a friend of mine who I was talking about what I was learning, and he goes and shares this very well put together answer. And I was like, I stopped him and I was like, hey, like, all that sounds great. Have you ever lost anybody like close to you? And he stops. He's like, no. I'm like, yeah, I didn't think so. Like, and I didn't say it in a way that was like, I'm better than you. It just was like, we're not connecting right now, and I feel like this is very theoretical for you. And I'm like, I have lost a lot of people in my life, and I've lost a lot of things, not just people. And that was one of the other things that was really good about the event, was it was like, you can grieve the loss of a person, you can grieve the loss of your health, you can grieve the loss of your dreams, and you can grieve the loss of anything else. And it's not just restricted to the person. And in some ways, the grief journey is a little bit different depending on what it is. But with this particular friend, I was just like, yeah, I didn't feel like we were connecting, because everything you said is very heady, and it sounds good, and I don't even think there's anything wrong with it, but it doesn't sound like there's a lot of experience in there. It's very black and white. And I'm like, grief is very gray. Like, there are certain things that you know, and then there's a whole lot of things that you don't. And a whole lot of things that you thought you knew that you may now no longer know. And that's very common in the experience, is for the earth to shake on the foundations of your theology or your belief system or whatever, and some things might pop loose that you weren't expecting. And you're like, well, what do I do with that now? That just happened. This corner of my house just collapsed, and I wasn't expecting it. I thought that was strong and sturdy. What do I do? So the ability to to your point, to speak the language, or for someone to say something when you are grieving, and then you kind of go, you too, you know, and they're like,
Yeah.
I know, and there are key words and phrases, or even just postures where, the guilt and shame that people feel oftentimes, at least with the guys that I deal with, it's not only I shouldn't feel this way, it's I'm being a burden to the people that love me, when in reality, the people that love them don't know how to handle heavy emotions. And so their response is either silence, physical or emotional space, or because they're uncomfortable, it's like, that was 6 years ago. Why are you not like, and it's just this, like, they're trying to move the person along because they can't handle their emotions. The person who's uncomfortable can't handle the grieving person's emotions. Instead of holding space and creating space to go, I'm here. I don't have the answers, but I can sit and listen and hold space. It's like the people that typically can do that are the people who have received that. And the people who have not received that, or haven't had to do the hard work of learning grief as a language, are the ones that don't know how to hold space for people. And so they either physically, emotionally retreat, they're just kind of silent and disconnected, or they get upset. We're like, why are we still talking about this? And it's like, dude, like, the reason we're still talking about it is because it's circular. We're in this stage again. And when it comes to grief, the worst thing in the world is not grieving, it's grieving alone. And so, like, the ability for someone to hold space can actually help healing happen and come back up onto this side of the circle and go, that part of me is now healed, or more healed, and I can come back into a deeper relationship that isn't just full of sadness. We're always going to have some form of sadness, but there are different ebbs and flows of how heavy that is.
Yeah, right, exactly. And like you said, to your point, when people get frustrated or they get silent or whatever it is, shouldn't you be past it? It's like it brings up this anger, but you almost can't blame them because we view grief on this linear path. And so it's like, if you don't walk it, you don't know that it's actually not linear. Like, you think I should be past it because you don't understand that it's a circle and not a line. And a couple of things I want to touch on that you just said that's really important. One, we talk about literally communicating with someone, and when you talk to them, you're like, hey, do you know what, like, loss is? You're like, yeah, I can kind of tell. My friend Catherine, who also had a stillbirth, introduced me to the term, I don't know if it's her term, but she introduced me to it, the loss lens. And it's like, you can almost immediately tell when you're speaking to someone who is wearing a loss lens, because everything they say flow, like, you literally can't take it off. It's a lens that you wear in every part of your life, every decision that you make, everything that comes out of your mouth, like, it's all seen through this lens. And it doesn't, it's not better than your lens. It's not, higher or, more important than anybody else's lens. It's just simply yours. And that's just simply the one that your life has given you to wear. And so kind of summing up what you were saying, it's like you can tell, yeah, you're not wearing that lens that I'm wearing. And,
That's right.
And the other thing I want to point out and make sure that everybody understands is that loss and grief, like you said, is not just about a particular, it doesn't have to just be a person. And to that point, my grief coach, actually, I brought her on once and I was answering some questions that people sent in to ask my grief coach. And I don't even remember what the question was, but basically what she was expounding on was how grief can be a loss of anything. Like you said, a person. It could be a divorce. She's had clients who have come to her who their house burned down and they're grieving the loss of the life that they had in that house. She's had a client, I believe, I hope this is accurate. I think what she said was she has had actual gold medalists or like Olympians who were trying to go for a gold medal, and they're grieving the loss of the life where they, in their mind, won a gold medal. And they were never able to earn that. So there's so many forms of grief, and there's so many different kinds of losses. It doesn't always just have to be a person. So even if you didn't lose a parent, a child, a friend, a spouse, like it, I think those are like the ones that people think are like, oh, those are profound losses. Those are the big ones. It's like, not making light of you losing your grandparent, but there is this stigma around like, oh, well, if they went before you, it's not as big. It's like, it has nothing to do with, it's not a competition. Loss is not a competition. Whoever has a loss, whether it's a person or a divorce or a house or a kitten, like they're all on their own grieving process. And so I just want to make sure that whoever's listening knows that, because it opens this topic up to so many more people.
Yeah.
And
that's
so,
nice.
yeah. And so I guess I'm curious, like, what your opinion is like, do you think it's possible for people who do speak fluently in grief, we'll say, or wear that loss lens, however you want to say it, do you think it's possible for those people to communicate with people who don't and actually have like an understanding of each other? Because I wrestle with that all the time.
That, it's funny. Today's Friday. I feel like depending on the day when you ask me that question, to your point, I feel like the answer like varies, because there are experiences where it's like, okay, like people who I know who haven't had, of their own admission, who haven't had serious loss. And again, like, the two things we're talking about here are like trauma comparison and grief comparison. They don't do anybody any good at all. Actually harm. Like if you think that your trauma is less than someone else's, you're actually doing yourself a disservice, versus like sitting with like the brevity and the intensity of, not the brevity, the intensity of whatever you went through. And it's the same with grief, where it's like you grieve your dreams the way that you grieve your dreams or the loss of someone, of a relationship. Like a couple of the guys were saying that they were like, this is just our opinion, but like it may be harder to grieve the loss of a person when they're still alive versus like when there's a finality. And there's like that's a debate, and not one that I want to have here, but just they were saying like there are different forms of grief, and they can all have their heavinesses. To your original question, I'll say it this way, like I have had people hold space, and I appreciate that, where they're like, I'm not fully sure what to do with what you just told me, but I want you to know that I'm here. And for me, at least in those moments when I was sharing certain like losses because of addiction and divorce and things like that, it's like they couldn't fix that. I knew they couldn't fix it. But what I was looking for was I was looking to connect. And they were at least able to hold space in a way where they're like, I don't know what to do. And especially as guys, like we have this like part of us, I don't know if it's Western culture or just all guys, but like this Mr. Fix-It mode is what I call it. Where like if you were to go to your husband, who I actually know, and like be like, here's what I'm feeling, and he's like, well, here's what you need to do. And you're like, no. I'm looking to connect. But we hop into Mr. Fix-It mode. It's just, and we have to get out of that, and that takes some work. But for those guys, they didn't hop into that. They were like, I don't know what to do, but I'm here, and you just tell me. And in those moments, that was enough. So in terms of being able to connect at a deep level and speak the language, those guys couldn't do that. But a couple of them could hold space, so I could at least be seen and heard, which in that moment is what I was looking for. So like, it's kind of a middle ground answer of like, it's not yes or no. It's like, the question in those moments when you're sharing your grief is, what do you need? It's the concept that's called attunement, which is kind of like tuning a piano, and you're listening as the piano key plays to make sure it's in the right key. So you're tuning it. Attunement is you're sitting with someone and you're sharing your heart and your soul and your wounds and your grief. And while they may not know the language, can they ask you, like, what do you need right now? I just need you to listen. I just need a hug. Okay? Like, that attunement, I think, can be really healthy. But when people can't do that, can't even do that, then we're on different pages. Then it's like, okay, I just shared something with you, and you didn't receive it well, and I don't feel seen. I actually feel like you're changing the conversation because you're uncomfortable. I'm probably not going to share something like that again. And it doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means they're not the right person for that conversation.
Yes, that is so perfectly said. I could not have said it better. And I love that phrase that you keep saying, that holding space. And it's funny because shortly after my loss, when I started, following accounts on Instagram and starting connecting with other moms who had lost babies, like I heard that term so often, like hold space, hold space. And in my head, I was like, it's such a cheesy term. Like, I don't know what it even really means. And I kind of just brushed it off. But as time passes and you learn to speak this language of grief, holding space is one of the only helpful healing things that the people around us can offer us, is to hold space for it, because you can't speak our language, and that's nobody's fault. It's not mine. It's not yours. I'm not better than you. You're not better than me, because we can't communicate in that way. So since we can't communicate that way, the only other thing that can help me is for you to hold space for me in this time, in this place where you know nothing about. And that goes for anything in life. Like to be a good friend, or to really be there for someone, is all about holding space. Like I don't know anything about addiction, meaning I haven't struggled with addiction in my life. But if I really care about someone and I want to be there for them, I don't know what it's like. So I can't offer you a lot of practical help, but I can hold space for somebody. And I can say, I have no idea what this feels like. I don't even really know how to help you get better. So I'm just going to sit here with you, and I'm going to hold space for what you're going through and what you're feeling. And addiction is a big one. It could be anything. It could be, I don't know, you broke your arm. If I've never broken my arm, I don't know what that feels like. So I can't say, oh, make sure you do this and that. I don't know. I don't know how to do that. But I can sit here with you, and I can hold space for it. And it's a really, really important concept, because that is, it gets lost. It's a lost form of relationship, truly. Because I know that there were people for me in my life, they didn't know what to do, and they were kind of vocal about it. And instead of holding space, there was like a bit of a separation. And it's a shame, because it doesn't have to be like that. And I don't really want to get into that, but I really, really love that phrase, because it's, like I said, it's a lost form of relationship that is truly all that can be offered in any area of life, but also in just true and in deep devastation. And so I kind of want to bring your like expertise into this, because you are a trauma-informed certified coach. And so I kind of want to talk about how trauma like ties into this topic. And I've actually had this question in my mind for a long time. I should have just messaged you at some point and been like, hey, what's your thoughts on this? But we're saving it for this episode, so that's great. Does grief automatically, like no matter what kind of grief it is or what kind of loss you have suffered, does grief automatically just come with trauma?
No. I would my personal opinion, no, because grief is active. Grief is a choice, right? Like when you learn a language, you go to school, and there's other things, but like learning a second language, right? Like if I'm learning French or Latin or German, and it's not my native language, that's a whole separate discussion about like grief being the native language that we have forgot. That's a philosophical discussion for another day. But to your actual point, grief is a choice, because grief implies that you're learning a second language. At least the way that I view it. You can choose not to grieve. I didn't grieve the loss of many things until I was probably 30 years old. And I lost a lot of people in my life at early ages. And I didn't know how to grieve them. I cried sometimes, but like particularly my grandfather, like I remember not being that upset. And I was angry, that I was ashamed, because I didn't know how to process it. I had no idea. And so I didn't enter into grief until with that, and the loss of relationships that held power over me for like decades.
Mm.
And I remember entering into that process, and really just from the gut level, it all came out. And some of that was tears, some of that was just different forms of processing. But does grief come with trauma? No. Should it? Yeah. Like the last time we talked, like you had asked me, like, what is trauma? It's like, trauma is not the event. Trauma is what's left over after the event. The traumatic event happens. And if that's not worked through, that is what trauma is. It's the residue of the event. And normally, traumatic experiences are a combination of either violation and or rupture in a relationship. Whether it's actual abuse between a parent or whatever, or sexual abuse, like there's a violation of some form, and then there's a rupture. And so healing implies that there's some form of repair and restoration. But when you don't have that, that's where trauma comes in. Grief is kind of the guide into the new language of healing and restoration that that comes when you actually process the loss. But for us, when we don't have the language and we don't know how to do it, and more importantly, when you actually think about it, other than breathing, every single thing other than breathing and then like bodily functions and like going to the bathroom, everything else is learned in life. We learn English from somebody else. We learn how to eat properly from someone else. We learn how to put on clothes, tie our shoes, forms of running, calculus, like it's all learned. And so to think that when we don't have an example of grief, and when we actually, for men at least, when we have the exact opposite of that, which is just suck it up, push it down. Well, now, how does grief automatically come with trauma when I've never seen how to do it? I think in some ways our bodies know how to do it. They know how to self-regulate. Like if you've ever seen a child when they're crying, and like that ugly crying, not that fake crying to get their sibling in trouble, but that ugly, like type of cry, like that short breath, that's actually a regulation technique that their body uses to soothe themselves. They don't even know they're doing it, but the body's taking over, going, we're overloaded, we got to come down. In some ways, I think there's some seeds of grief language in there. But when those don't get fostered, and particularly for men, at least in the West, when we see the opposite of that, well, now, when somebody's life blows up and they come to me and they're like, my behavior's sideways, I'm like, tell me about shame and tell me about your grief. And normally they have no idea, because there's so much shame overloading their life, and there's probably so many horrific things that have happened to them that they've never grieved, that it's not, in my mind, it's not hand in hand. In a perfect world, it would be. If trauma had to happen, it would be like, okay, they know how to grieve right after that and process it, and there can be a form of repair before all the sideways behavior comes out decades later.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so kind of backing up a little bit, because you said something and I was like, okay, I wonder if I've been what's the word? Misdefining this. So for me, I clearly have made the choice to grieve and to make, grief a part of my life. And I've always called a lot of the things that I have gone through traumatic. Like if you ask me, like, do you have any trauma? I would say like, yeah. But now that I'm listening to you and I'm kind of processing the difference between, and that one doesn't come with the other, or that not all grief comes with trauma, is the original question that I asked. I think back to a lot of these moments where, because you described it almost like a rupture. I've experienced traumatic moments in my life. At least that's what I'm defining it as.
Sure.
For example, watching my husband I mean, in the hospital for 50 days, tied up on tubes and in the machines and dealing with chest pains and in just, the worst kinds of pains, and pain meds aren't enough. Like watching my husband go through that, I would consider those traumatic events or memories that I have. And, the most traumatic one I can think of is hearing that our baby had no heartbeat. That moment for me, if you ask me, I will tell you, that is a traumatic moment for me. But I have chosen to grieve the loss of her. And I have chosen to decide to, heal myself in the ways that I can, to not dwell on those memories of my husband. So if we make that choice to grieve, and sorry for putting you on the spot, I'm just processing all my own feelings here.
Good. Yeah.
If we make that choice to grieve and say, I'm going to heal from this, does it release you from that trauma? Because I know you described the difference between trauma and a traumatic event. They're two very different things. If you ask me, have you had traumatic events? I would say yes. Do I deal with trauma in my life? Like, I don't think I would say yes to that. Is that because I've chosen to grieve and to heal and to, do these things to, move forward and make our lives better since those traumatic events?
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, it's a great question. So let me just ask a few probing questions to make sure I get some clarity. So after the event with your daughter, would you say that for the next season, you were a different person in the way that your body functioned, the way that your mind functioned, the way that your heart functioned, the way that your spirit functioned?
Like physically?
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. That's true.
I feel like it took, because what happened was that happened. And then as I felt like my body was just starting to like become back to my, my norm or my baseline, that's when my husband was super, super sick. And so this is what it felt like to me. This is not a scientific, answer, but what it felt like is it was like, okay, I'm slowly working, up this hill to get myself feeling better and more like myself. And then I kind of like plummeted again because it was kind of all coming back just in a different form. It wasn't my loss anymore. It was my husband being sick.
Right. And so last time we talked, if I remember correctly, you had said how even sometimes pulling up to the hospital, like your body kicks on, right?
Yes.
And so that's the nervous system going, okay, like this feels familiar. Here's what's going on. There could be a threat. The trauma is what's left over after the traumatic event, and that gets stored in our bodies. It can get stored in our minds. It can get stored in our hearts, and it can get stored in our souls, in the sense of, well, what do I do now? And particularly two things. One, there was a rupture. There was an actual rupture when you had a stillbirth. The relationship was ruptured, right? And so it's a traumatic event. And now, if you don't choose grief, you are left with a rupture that will form trauma and will come out sideways. It's inevitable because we're not meant to carry that for long periods of time. That's why people like develop maladaptive. Me at the front of this line. There's no judgment. I'm just saying this is what happens. People develop maladaptive behaviors that you look at and go, what is that? Like that's so strange. What is that? And what it is it's unprocessed trauma. And grief is the way that we walk through that. And there's different forms of that. Like I go to trauma therapy. There's normal counseling. Like when your body's acting weird, you have to get that stuff out. And there are different techniques to do that. In the case of your husband, there is a rupture in a relationship that's no one's fault. And now all of a sudden, your body remembers what it felt like to lose big. And it's going, I don't want to do that again. Yeah. And yet when there's this feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, it's like it's like someone's pouring sand through in your hands and you're trying to hold on to every grain and it's just slipping through your fingers. And you're like, I can't do anything. What am I supposed to do? And that feeling of powerlessness and helplessness, number one, can definitely create trauma. And number two, when we've had it and it comes back, the intensity of that experience can be like, I don't want to go through this again. I don't want to do it again. And that body gets real tense, and anxiety and other things or depression can come up from that. So for you, at least the way you've described it, you absolutely have had a traumatic event. And I would even scale out with your husband a traumatic season. That's not just in a single event. There are things that, like, and again, I know him. And so seeing your stories and talking with him, and it's like, there are just these things that create havoc in the body in terms of responses. Like, our nervous system is like, I am overloaded. I don't know what to do. And that's why it's so important to have people in community, to where when you do talk with them, they can hold the space, because even that connection of them holding space, there's so many things that happen in the body. Being able to release things of the right brain connecting with their right brain and feeling seen and heard, being able to release the stress, release what could be trauma because the rupture is being repaired. Like, there's so many things that are so important in that process. That's why guys get into so much trouble, because we don't know how to do that. And so we never get a chance to actually offload stuff. And guys' lives blow up, and people are like, what happened? I didn't know anything was wrong. And it's like, dude, he's been in trouble. Normally, at least the guys I see, I'm like, you've been in trouble for years. You just didn't know what to do. You didn't have the relationship with another guy to be able to actually connect with them on a level where you felt seen and heard and could get some of that stuff off and offload that, so your soul, your heart, your mind, and your body could actually breathe again. And so for you, choosing to enter into the grief early, well, now that traumatic event has far less of a chance to leave the residue of trauma, because you're choosing to process through it and going, I'm going to fight like hell to get through this. And I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know how it's going to go, but I'm making the choice. And I'm sure for those that are familiar with grief, that's not a one-time choice. I wake up in the morning and go, today's like, win the day. I'm going to try to win today because that's all I have. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It very much does. And the way that I know that it makes sense is because, I had mentioned just driving up to the hospital creates that like response, like in my body. I can I can go to the hospital now and have a much less of a physical reaction.
Yep.
Now, I think that's twofold. I think we've had so many other experiences in that building now that I'm like, who the heck knows what's going to happen this time, kind of thing. But I think a bigger part of it is because you're never at the hospital unless you are bringing a living baby home. Like, you're almost never at the hospital for like a good reason. If you can track with that, like something's broken, something's wrong, something needs repair, something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but now I can drive by and look at it and go, "What's up?" You know what I mean? Like, rather than going like, like, don't look, and like literally my heart starting to race and all those things.
Yeah.
And I think the bigger part of that is, like you said, choosing to grieve and to make choices that allow me to heal from those times, and to not allow. And for me, a big part of it was fear. I mean, when I was living in fight or flight, I mean, you're afraid of everything. You're afraid of everything and nothing all at the same time.
Right.
And so for me, like you said, a lot of that was my nervous system. Like, I literally just put a post out today that talked about one of the first steps that we took to healing was nurturing my nervous system, and just bringing it, just calming it down. And I could talk for hours about that because I've learned so much about it, and I'm sure you could too. But that's how I know what you're saying is true, and it makes sense because it's like I'm living it. I'm walking through it. I think it would be very easy for me to still have these physical reactions to the hospital, to my daughter's dresser filled with her clothes and things like that. All of these things. And don't get me wrong, there are still things that I probably haven't chosen to grieve. And I won't get into those, but there are definitely certain things that still produce a physical response.
Yeah.
But you got to take it slow and take things one thing at a time. Especially,
Right.
like you said, I really like that you called it a season, because that's what it was, especially with my husband being sick. It was a season. It was not an event. And
Yeah.
which that's why when I tell people that season for me was almost heavier than my loss, because it wasn't a greater loss because he walked out okay, but it felt so much heavier because it like wasn't one traumatic event. It was a
Yes.
season. And so when the
Yeah.
season was over, I was like way more like beaten down. Like the weight on my shoulders was literally heavier than the
Yeah.
weight of the season, I guess, or the event that we went through with losing our daughter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And two things that you said I think are really important. One is like the concept of it being season. It's you're processing through at that point, not just one event. To your point, it's there are many little micro and macro events that are there that can just stack. It's like you said, the weight on your shoulders. It's like there's a backpack, and with each event, and micro and macro, a brick is being thrown in there, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And if you don't process that you're just going to carry it, and that's where the sideways behavior comes, is because you're just like, I can't process this, so I'm going to use something and find something to anesthetize how I feel. Insert addiction. This is why addiction is never the root problem. Addiction is the answer to the root problem that becomes a secondary problem. And until you take care of the root problem, which is normally trauma, loss, abandonment, something like that, the addiction will spin. And so the second thing that I think is essential for any person of faith that is listening right now to hear is you are not just a soul. And as funny as that sounds, what happens, and you may or may not have experienced this, in grief and loss, particularly in the faith world, there's this like, just pray about it, like, well, all things work together, and there's it's what's called spiritual bypassing, which is, again, they don't know how to sit with the pain, and so they give you what they got, and it's not that great, respectfully.
Yeah.
And but what happens is, for people that don't know how their body works, they think that because when they pass a hospital and their body kicks on, that they don't have enough faith. And It's like, that couldn't be further from the truth. What's happening is you have a nervous system that works a specific way, and it's actually doing its job, which is telling you there was a threat there before, there might be a threat there again. And so, to your point, if we don't have a holistic solution to some of this stuff, we end up actually creating more damage in people, because we're telling them to address a spiritual problem when it's not a spiritual problem. It's a physical and emotional problem that happens to affect the spiritual, yes. But the nervous system is not a spiritual problem. That's a physical problem. And so that's where we need holistic solutions in the faith communities to things like addiction and to things like grief and trauma. And what ends up happening is people walk away because they think that they're doing it wrong, and they're just like, I'm done. It's not working. And it's like, that's because you were handed half the equation. You were handed half of the cheat sheet here. You need the other half right now, which is, if you do some nervous regulation techniques, you're going to be fine. You're going to be okay.
Yeah.
It's not just about prayer, although we need to pray. It's not just about faith, although I would say we need faith. It's about breathing techniques. It's about understanding how your nervous system works to either bring it down or bring it up out of shutdown, because that's the other side, where it's like, we got to get you up out of shutdown, because that's a real thing. So I want people who are people in the communities to hear that, because it's so, so important. And I see it on the addiction side with guys where they've got some of the mental in like memorization of scripture and things like that, which is good. And then the spiritual, but they don't know their emotions, which are actually plaguing them, and they don't know their bodies, and they wonder why they can't get free of addiction. And it's like, you need all four. You are all four of those things all the time. And it's the same in grief too, for me.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And I am literally a walking testimony of that, because, excuse me, early on in my loss. This was okay. So our loss was in November. And so that following, maybe like August or so, is when this idea of grief counseling came to my attention. And I was at a point where that adrenaline of like the loss and the people bringing food and dropping off gift cards and flowers and that initial like shock was just starting to like wear off. And the way that my grief coach always explained it, like the adrenaline was wearing off and the reality was setting in. And so that's where at that point where I literally felt my nervous system, like everything was a threat, you know, because the adrenaline was no longer pumping. And now my nervous system was like, you know, hey, look at all these threats around. And so I was just like, it was every symptom there was to experience, I was experiencing. And there was nothing wrong, meaning like, it's not like my husband who had an autoimmune disease and it was spiraling because his nervous system was shutting down. It was my nervous system just on overdrive. And I couldn't figure out how to tell it, like, you need to calm down, because I didn't know this was a thing. Like you said, everybody wanted to offer me their spiritual platitudes and, you know, God is good and he's bigger and he's got a plan and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that doesn't change the way that my body is freaking out right now. That's like how the only way I could know how to describe it. And so I remember when someone brought the idea to me of trying grief counseling, I was like, I can't even think about that right now. Like, I need to get healthy first, and then I'll think about, you know, grief counseling.
Yeah.
And the ironic twist is, well, two things. One, the first thing she does is she teaches you how to calm your nervous system, if that's what needs to be done to control, you know, your nervous system. And that's what my doctor was doing too. He was putting me on, you know, adrenal supplements and all of these things. So we addressed my nervous system. That was number one. And the funniest, so the most ironic thing is I was pushing it off because I wanted to get healthy first, or I wanted to get the physical world under control. And really, that's what makes her so amazing. And I think different than a lot of just counselors who are just there to talk with you, is she's like, no, like, to your point, exactly. Like, this is a physical response that your body is happening. And if you do not address the physical issues, like none of the spiritual parts of it, it's not that they don't matter. It's like you said, they're both there. They're both important. They both need to happen. And so, yes, shout it from the rooftops. Anybody who is listening, like, that is so important, because you cannot, the spiritual part is not enough. It's not enough.
And that almost sounds,
God is not enough.
Right. Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
It's not. Yeah, it's not to say that God is not enough. It's over. That's one of the things that I made a whole episode about it. The title of the episode is called "Stop Saying God is Good," and my point is, in the episode, is I'm not an atheist all of a sudden. I do believe that God is good. The point is you saying that to me doesn't help me right now. And I was kind of speaking up for the people early on in their grief who people just come up and go, well, God is good. Like, I was kind of speaking on their behalf and looking at you and going, I know that that's not helping you right now. So, hey, everybody who's saying it, stop saying it. It's not helpful. like, they need practical, helpful things in their life right now, not your spiritual platitudes.
Yes. No, that's fantastic. And it's funny because, like, there's still a part of me that, like, winces when you say the spiritual's not enough, and I fully agree with you.
I know.
And that's just a culture that's still in there, where I'm like, okay, like, she's absolutely right, because we are all of those things all the time. And I see it in addiction all the time, where I work with men of all ages into their 70s, you know, and there are guys in there that are in the faith world that are pastors, and I'm like, you have master's degrees. Why isn't it enough? Why is it not enough? And they just look at me, and I'm like, it's because you have half the formula. You have no idea how your body works. You don't know how to talk about your emotions, which are anchored into those traumatic events and trauma, where you felt specific ways, and those created mental narratives of how life works. And all of that separates you from the practical reality, at least in the Christian faith, of how God is with you. And you can know that up here, but your body, your heart, and especially your gut, which is about safety and protection, they don't care. They don't care and they don't know. And so how do you create that connection again with the four parts of you? Typically for the guys, they're so disconnected with themselves that ultimately they're disconnected with everyone around them and with their relationship with God or their higher power. And so my job is to go, let's reconnect and let's pull the obstacles out, typically traumatic events or stories, and process through those, help them learn how to grieve, and reconnect you with yourself so that you can actually show up as you were made to be. And ultimately, my hope would be that their spiritual relationship does grow. And I think, at least I've seen it with guys I work with, where that's the benefit of it, is now there's real practical proximity. Theologically, nothing has changed, but practically for them, they're experiencing things very, very differently. And it's because we do nervous system work. It's because we do story work around the lies and the emotions that they felt in those events that happened to them and the ones that they themselves were culprits of. But in the faith community, it's very one-dimensional, and we wonder why things don't work well. It's because we're not one-dimensional beings. We're at minimum four-dimensional beings, maybe more. I don't know. But those four domains of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, you need all of them all the time. Mm-hmm. To your point of you being a testimony for that, of like, once you were able to get your nervous system to come down, now the work could actually begin. But if we just sit and pray, that doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, but for a lot of people, they're in the wrong domain. They're starting in the wrong place. No, start in the physical. Let's get your nervous system down or up, and now we can dig into the internals of mental, emotional, and spiritual.
And I think sometimes God's like, hey, like, I designed your body so beautifully to work this way. Like, figure out how it works. I feel like God is just such a realist. Like, sometimes it's like we tend to over spiritualize things, and God's like, do you know how beautifully and intricately your body is made? Like, I literally designed it to do what it's doing right now. Like, the best thing you could do for yourself is learn what it's doing and how to respond and all of those things. I feel like God probably looks at those spiritual platitudes and those cliches and all those things and is like, okay, yeah, that's true. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's the way that God has, because it's like, what's the point of being such unique and special beings if we're not in tune with the way that we're created? You know,
I couldn't have said it better. I totally agree. And I mean, like the phrase that I've adopted is, it's like, you know, I'm praying in the supernatural, but I'm working in the natural. And it's, you know, it's like you know, like you and your husband and many other people, including myself, were praying for supernatural healing.
Right.
And you went to the hospital. Why?
Right.
Because we know how the body works. So why would we not do the same with healthy psychology that's not full of toxic positivity of you can never do anything wrong? That's not true. We do a whole lot of stuff wrong, and we got to process through that. But healthy psychology, there's enough data now to go, this is how the body works. Here's how the mind generally works. Here's what emotions are and how to process them. And then it filters into the spiritual in my mind. And that includes, circling back around, that includes grief. Because it's important to know what you're feeling in your body, because we don't feel our emotions in our brains. We feel them in our bodies. We feel fear and anxiety, typically in the chest, shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, like heart rate increases. We start to sweat. Like, there are all sorts of signs that we are feeling emotions. But if we are not in touch with our bodies, we're not going to know what we're feeling. And more importantly, what are those emotions trying to tell us? Because they're trying to send us messages that we can, if we can decipher, we can know where we are, and then we can figure out what we need to do. But if all we do is pray, and we're not in touch with the way that, to your point, that we have been designed, we're shortchanging ourselves, and then we get frustrated with God and with others. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
Like, let's cooperate with the way that we're made and then see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's so fascinating. Yeah, and I hope this message spreads, to everybody who is grieving, because it is so complicated, and early on in loss and trauma and all of the things that we talked about today, it can be very overwhelming, and the world that we live in today is very overwhelming, and they want to tell you about the 5 stages of grief, and they want to tell you that grief is linear, and all these things that we talked about today. It can be overwhelming. So don't feel stupid. Don't feel like you're doing it wrong. You just have to get educated. You have to find the right people who can help, walk you through these steps, and listen to, episodes like this that are enlightening you, and bringing you this information. So, I mean, we're at the 1 hour mark, so we'll wrap it up for today. But thank you so much for, just agreeing to be here and unpacking this. This grief is a language, rather than a journey. It's a really fascinating concept, and I really appreciate all of your, your knowledge and your expertise on all of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again, and for what you're doing, the platform that you are using to spread the message. It's really, really, really impactful.
Of course. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's listening. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Don't forget, a positive review always goes a really long way, and me continuing to get messages like these out, and also subscribing to the channel will alert you of more episodes just like this one. I can't wait to chat with you all again really soon. Signing off for now, your hope dealer, Emmy Smaz.